We continue our look at the origin of Western philosophy. Now, one interesting thing about philosophy is that it actually has a birthday. Traditionally, philosophy's origin is dated to around the 6th century BC. One of the challenges, of course, is trying to sort of look back with our definition of philosophy today and see when it came about back then. There's also the obvious problem if we're going way back in time like that, we've lost so much information, so many records, that this could all be inaccurate in terms of this being the true origin. And so we always have to consider the fact that our history, data is limited, and we could be wrong about many aspects of it. That said, this is the best information we have at this time. So in terms of who gets credit for the origin of philosophy, and also the origin of science, it goes back to our good dead friend Thales. So why does he get credit for science and philosophy? Well, his initial claim to fame arises because he predicted an eclipse would occur on May 28th, 585 BC, and he got it right. Now, from this, he supposedly inferred that because he could predict natural events, it meant they did not result from the unpredictable gods, or mere chance, or fate. He concluded that such events arose from a consistent, impersonal, natural order, and this natural order can be studied. And it can be studied to provide generalizations and predictions. And so we see here the beginnings of what we now would regard as science. Now, Thales, of course, did not arise out of nothing, except, obviously the very first person to do something absolutely on their own. Everyone else afterwards, of course, has to rely on the work that others have provided for them. So, what influenced Thales? Well, what it's believed that he did is this. From Egypt, he acquired mathematics, specifically understanding of geometry, etc. And the Babylonians, fortunately, had been conducting astronomy for various reasons for quite some time. So combining math and observation of the stars, he was able to make this prediction. So essentially science becomes observation and math, kind of crudely put. So he's considered to be the first Western philosopher, as far as we know. Lived approximately 624 to 545 BC. Again, we don't have the exact records about this. And he lived in Miletus, a Greek port city in Ionia, which is now Western Asia Minor. The city, not surprisingly, was a trading city with extensive contact with other cultures. And we generally see intellectual, scientific, philosophical, artistic advancement with cultures that are not closed, that have extensive contact with other cultures, exchanges of ideas, etc. And the story of human advancement often involves interaction between cultures. In some cases, unfortunately, involves war, but it often, less often to be honest, involves peaceful interaction. So Thales just didn't pop out of nowhere, doing his stuff. Again, as I mentioned, he used mathematics, developed in Egypt, and Babylonian observations. He also had quite a backstory behind him. He solved engineering problems, developed navigational instruments, navigational techniques, and all this, of course, establishes him as the first scientist and also perhaps one of the early engineers. So why the philosophy title as well? Well, here's why. He is credited, to the best of our knowledge, with beginning the debate over the ultimate nature of reality, that is to say, the beginnings of metaphysics. Now, one of the problems that he discovered or created, depending on how you look at it, is the problem of the one and the many, which we're still fighting with today. Thales, like so many who came after him, was determined to find the unity that underlie the diversity of the world. The one thing that makes up everything. The one thing that explains everything. So the problem of the one and the many involves determining the basic principle, or the basic thing that accounts for everything. And this is something that they still try to do in the sciences, to find, say, the one theory to rule them all, or the one whatever it is that makes up everything. And we're still trying to do this today. Now, we don't have actual writings from Thales like in a library, unfortunately. So much has been lost throughout history. In many cases intentionally destroyed, other cases through disaster and accident. But according to our good dead friend Aristotle, Thales claimed that water is the fundamental source, foundation of everything. So, it's all water, according to him. Now, you might be familiar with the classic elements from Greek mythology: earth, wind, fire, and water. And Thales went with water. Now, according to our good dead friend Aristotle, the reason for this is essentially his arguments that Thales had. Again, this is according to Aristotle. Water, we know, is essential to life, so it seems really important. Also, water has many interesting properties, and it can become a solid. In fact, ice is considered a metamorphic rock, if my earth science is still good, but probably not, a long time ago. It can also become a gas and a liquid. It has many states. And so it seems plausible that it could take on these many forms. Thales also noted that seeds, like when you cut them open, they're moist. Then if you look at the way nature works, rain falls to the ground, mist rises, and when you have evaporation, because back in those days they didn't have microscopes, but when water evaporates, especially like seawater, it leaves behind a sediment. And given that they had no microscopes, a reasonable interpretation would be is that when the water evaporates, what's left behind is solid water. I mean, again, today we know better. It's just the particles and stuff in the water. But this is the beginnings of science. Also, if you dig down into the earth, you'll typically, if you're near the coast, you'll find water. Now, we don't know his actual arguments. One thing about things way back in the way back is typically we just have what someone else said about someone. In some cases, it's what someone said about someone, it said about someone, said about someone, said about someone who heard from their cousin who read about it one day. And so the chain of accuracy can be, pretty weak. But he gets the credit for being the first philosopher and the first scientist. So his first problem, again, is the one and the many. What is the one thing that makes up everything? And again, big problem in metaphysics and science to this day. We've still not solved that. Second problem is the problem of permanence and change. If there is a single basic substance, for example, water, what is it that causes it to change into other things? Why does water become other stuff? Like humans and dirt and air and all this other stuff. Now, Thales' explanation, at least according to, what Aristotle claimed, he said that everything was full of gods. But this doesn't seem to be a religious thing. Not that it was literally like Zeus and so forth hanging out in there. It seemed to be his way of trying to say, develop the language to say that the animating forces, the change, dwell or reside within the things that change. So instead of being outside, the change being imposed upon them, the change arises from the inside. For example, one thing that's long fascinated people, and even to this day, is magnets. How do they work? And his explanation of magnetism was that it was a animate causal power in, the stones. And the Greeks called magnets, at least, obviously the English translation would be lodestone. And so he's trying to explain things in terms of forces within things, which is something that science still does today, at least some versions. So why was, or is, Thales important? Well, philosophically, he made many contributions. First one is this. He presented the first known form of what philosophers called monism. This is the view there is one basic ontological kind, or principle of explanation. In other words, reality is made of one metaphysical type. Now, the most common opposing view is what we philosophers call dualism. Not duels like, pistols or swords at dawn, but dual as in two. And one of the most famous dualists is our good dead friend Descartes, and his view is that you are your soul or mind, and you have a body, called classical Cartesian dualism, where you've got physical stuff and you've got mental stuff. There's also a view called idealism, sometimes called phenomenology, in which everything is just mind. It's all mental. Our good dead friend Berkeley had this view. He's the, if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, doesn't make a sound, he's that guy. And his answer was yes, because God's always there to hear it. Now for Thales, as we saw, the world, reality is water. And many followers were influenced by Thales, and they embrace monism. In fact, even today, there are thinkers, philosophers, scientists who embrace a form of monism. Typically, it's materialism, the view that everything is matter. And coincidentally enough, Thales presented the first known form of philosophical materialism, sometimes known as philosophical physicalism. Now, it's not materialism in the sense of liking really sweet cars and diamonds and fine champagnes, but it's the view that everything is matter. Everything is a physical, metaphysical thing. And this is super popular today. Most philosophers are materialist monist. One thing, that thing is matter. Now, he also made contributions in terms of methodology. First, asking questions that are aimed at theoretical understanding as opposed to merely practical questions. And this is not to say that he didn't do practical stuff, but the notion that theoretical understanding has value, and it doesn't have to be purely practical, he kind of got that going. Again, we don't know for sure if he was the first person to do this, but he gets credit for it. He also presented and supported a theory that could be examined and debated by others. He did not appeal to tradition and say this is true because we've always said this, or we've always done this, or authority. He didn't say this is true because some authority says. And we'll see as we go through some of the history of philosophy throughout the course of the course, this is kind of a common, changing point in philosophy, where eventually what happens is philosophers just start accepting authorities and tradition, and then there's a revolution. And every so often, philosophy kind of gets really clogged up, and then fortunately, someone comes along and notices the clog and shakes it up again. So that is our look at Thales. And next time, we'll take a look at the sophists, which in a way are part of the origin story of Socrates and Plato. In this story, they're the villains, but of course in their own story, they're the heroes.